Good evening. I'm Meg Brazil with the Norman Williams Public Library, and tonight we'll be bringing you Alexander Wolff, and with him this evening will be Bill Colson. And I just wanted to thank you all for your support over this past year. We've had, gosh, I'm not really sure how many events, but I know we presented over 14 authors and many, many more books than that and many more people than that. And it's actually, in that way, been a great year. And we hope we'll be bringing you back to the library for more events soon in person. And we certainly hope that Alex will come back at some point and come visit us in Woodstock and talk more about this amazing book. His new book is called Endpapers, A Family Story of Books, War, Escape, and Home. It's a sweeping portrait of the turmoil of the 20th century and the legacy of immigration as seen through the German-American family of celebrated book publisher Kurt Wolff. And it's also many, many things beyond that. Bill is going to tell you more about Alex. So for a moment, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Bill Colson. He's actually on the library's board of directors. He's a retired journalist who spent 25 years with Sports Illustrated in New York City. From 1996 to 2002, managing editor of the magazine. And during his career at Sports Illustrated, he covered everything from college and professional football, tennis and hockey, as well as the summer and winter Olympic Games. Bill and his wife, Vic, live in Woodstock, and he joined the board of the Norman Williams Public Library in 2016. And we're enormously grateful to have him here, not only on our board, but to have us here with us this evening. So I would now like to bring Bill and Alex on live.
Hello, Meg.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to leave it to you to take it away.
Okay, Meg. That's more than enough about me. What I would like to say a few more words about Alex before we get to Endpapers. Alex and I were friends and colleagues at Sports Illustrated for 22 years. During that time, Alex became one of the premier magazine writers of his generation, a rare feat for a sports writer. And truth to, Alex was never really a sports writer, never someone whose work was confined to X's and O's or the field and the arena. For Alex, sports was always a lens through which to examine the larger world. Having read a lot of Alex's work over the years, I can tell you that his exquisite skills as a reporter and a prosist have never been put to better use than they are in Endpapers. As many of you know, the guests in these discussions at the Norman Williams Public Library are often local writers, and Alex is no exception. For the past 19 years, Alex, his wife Vanessa, and their 2 children have lived in Middlebury. But Alex's Vermont bona fides go much farther back. In the early 1960s, when Alex was a small child, his parents bought a farmhouse up the road in Barnard. Fun fact number 1. Years later, he would co-write the In-Your-Face basketball book, which chronicles the myriad iterations of playground basketball as it's played around the world. One of the playground courts featured in the book is none other than the one at the rec center here in Woodstock, where in his younger days, Alex spent many hours perfecting his 15-foot fadeaway jump shot. Fun fact number 2, from 2005 to 2010, Alex owned the late, great Vermont Frost Heaves, the state's only professional basketball team. And I'm holding up right now yearbooks, 3 yearbooks from the years 2008 through 2010. And don't even think about trying to make a bid for them. And they may not become a Honus Wagner 1910 original baseball card value, but I'm hanging on to them. It's hard to know where to begin talking about Endgames because it engages the readers on so many levels. Alex, you write, quote, "The book is an amalgam of history, journalism, and memoir folded around 2 biographical chronologies. It is indeed the story of 2 remarkable men, both born and raised in Germany, both with Jewish roots, both caught in the crosshairs of World War II. The first is the author's grandfather, Kurt Wolff, who founded 2 of the most important publishing houses of the 20th century and whose writers included Franz Kafka, Kafka, Günter Grass, and Boris Pasternak. Kurt fled his homeland the day after the Reichstag fire in 1933, and 7 years later, with his second wife and young son, made a Casablanca-like escape out of Vichy France into Spain, and soon thereafter made his way to America. The other central character is Kurt's son and Alex's father, Nico, who remained behind in Germany with his mother, Kirk's first wife, Elizabeth Merck, and heir to the Merck pharmaceutical fortune. Nico served in the German army on the Russian front and in the Battle of the Bulge, immigrated to the United States after the war, earned a PhD in chemistry from Princeton, and went on to a long, fulfilling career at DuPont, RCA, and Xerox. I know this is a wholly inadequate introduction to this rich social, political, and personal history. So Alex, please put some flesh on the bones of your grandfather and father to tell us why finding out more about them was important enough for you to pack up your family and move to Berlin for a year.
Bill, thanks so much for the introduction. I suppose the very, very brief way of looking at my grandfather and my father and the way their lives unspooled is you had this big smoking hole in the middle of the 20th century, which was what happened to Europe with the Third Reich. And my grandfather took one path around that big smoking hole, fled the Nazis, and my father, left behind with his non-Jewish mother because of a divorce, took another path more through that smoking hole. And as you mentioned, ended up serving Hitler on two fronts. The fact that he was partially Jewish didn't bother the Nazis if they were going to find a spot for him in their armed forces. There were, in fact, about 150,000 soldiers of Jewish descent who served in the armed forces of the Third Reich. My father, only one of them. But those facts and so many other facts, not just about my grandfather and father, but also my extended family, those were the things that drew me to Berlin. So I spent those 36 years working at SI, 6 of them very much for Bill. And it just seemed right after the 2016 Olympics in Rio to do what Germans of my generation, which is to say people born in the late 50s and maybe during the 60s did long ago, which was to ask pointed questions about what happened and how might blood relatives have been implicated in what happened. And what were these things that immediate post-war generation of Germans just refused to talk about? There was this heavy silence that kind of hung over the country in the 10 or 15, 20 years after the war ended. So indeed, in 2017, Vanessa and I scooped up our 2 kids who were just beginning high school. We moved to Berlin, and it wasn't just to rummage around archives. It was to go through all sorts of family papers, letters, diaries, appointment books, and so forth, but also to doorstep relatives, to ask them what they knew and see if I could piece together the whole story. And sharing with you a little bit of that sense of orientation that I had to go through, it probably makes sense for me to read a brief passage that falls early in the book, and it's about our neighborhood in Berlin. And one of the things that the Germans were spectacularly good at, I thought, during our time there, I noticed it right away, was they've integrated into their public life and civic life so many ways of allowing for remembrance and reflection and memorializing the past. And one of the forms that this takes is in the simplest kind of memorial, which I'm going to share with you if you indulge me here for a few paragraphs. Each morning, our kids go off to school on an S-Bahn headed for the Wannsee, where in January 1942, the Nazis signed off on the final solution. In the afternoon, they return on a train bound for Oranienburg, from which the SS oversaw it. We buy meat and produce in the market hall, in which Karl Herz, the Jewish mayor of Kreuzberg, after being chased from City Hall and dragged through the streets by brown shirts of the SA, was beaten on a spring day in 1933. Walking around our Kiez, as Berliners call a neighborhood, we come across some of the more than 5,000 Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones, brass cobblestone memorials nested in the sidewalks of the city, each commemorating a Berliner victimized by the Nazis and set outside the last home he or she freely chose. Dates of detention and murder come inscribed beneath each name in recitative simplicity. The power of the Stolpersteine lies in their subtle obtrusiveness, whereas you must consciously make a destination of immured, monochromatic gravestones in a cemetery, stumbling stones glint up at you throughout the open city, nuggets in the creek bed. To read an inscription, you bend at the waist in a kind of bow of respect. As memorials go, Stolpersteine derive an animating power from being a work in progress, as tens of thousands of Berliners are yet to be memorialized. It's a sobering fact, the historian Timothy Snyder points out, that, quote, cultures of memory are organized by round numbers, intervals of 10, but somehow the remembrance of the dead is easier when the numbers are not round, when the final digit is not a 0. And that's precisely why each stone in our neighborhood calls out as it does, testifying to the meaning of one particular spot in the life of one particular person, insisting on its place in our daily routine. Cross the street to the ice cream stand, weighing whether to enjoy one scoop or two, but only after you remember Wilhelm Butcher, the widower with a wooden leg, who rather than finger other gay Berliners, killed himself in September 1936 in the Alexanderplatz jail 2 weeks after police took him into custody. Fill out a transfer slip at the bank on the corner, and you do so steps from where a month apart in early 1943, the Jewish cousins Ruth Gerstel and Erwin Rones were detained and deported, fate unknown, their stone tells us. Approach the threshold of the nearest chain store to buy sundries, and you're reminded that a tailor and postal worker named Martin Jaffe, who performed 6 years of forced labor at a chemical plant in nearby Tempelhof, lived here in a third-floor apartment before being arrested at work in February 1943, whereupon the Nazis, having decided to bring in captured Slavs from the east to replace Jews like Jaffe, sent him first to the ghetto at Theresienstadt and then to his death. Just around the corner from where we live, the stumbling stone nearest to us, Erna Wolff, deported on December 14th, 1942, murdered in Auschwitz. No relation as far as I know, and I really don't know. So that gives you a little sense of how we took our bearings in Berlin, and I should say that 4 days after we arrived in Berlin, Charlottesville happened. Americans were marching in an American town chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And the German elections, with Angela Merkel standing against the Alternative for Germany party, which was embracing a lot of the themes of the far right, were to take place in September. So only 5-6 weeks after we arrived. So suddenly what I thought was going to be an exercise in looking back invited me very much to consider what was happening in the moment. And having been trained as a journalist, not as a historian, not as a biographer, but as a journalist, it's one of the reasons I tried to fold some journalism into the book and write what it was that we were experiencing, the entire process of unpacking this whole story.
So staying on how this is so very personal to you, I want to go back to your father and your grandfather, particularly your father, who you make it clear was reluctant to share anything about what he went through during the war. Yet your grandfather, who lived out the war and nice and pretty cozy situation as a bon vivant aesthete in New York City, missed all that horror. And how did that make you feel about your relationship with the two of them? And did you feel your grandfather was judgmental at all, looking at the rest of your family, the ones who, not just Nico, but his sister and his mother, Nico's mother, Kurt's first wife, who had to remain back in Germany?
Yeah, the experience, I guess it goes back to that smoking hole and those two paths that my dad and grandfather each took around it. Yeah, Kurt he had his anxious moments, no question. I mean, he fled within 48 hours of the Reichstag fire. He happened to be in Berlin when it took place. And he and my step-grandmother were listening to Hermann Goering ranting on the radio, and it led Kurt to turn to Helen and say, "These are madmen, pack." And so they went off to London, got married, found their way to France. They got a job working for the French Foreign Ministry, actually writing German language leaflets that French aircraft could drop over western edges of Germany during this period, which was known as the Phony War, before things went live. So they had already cast their lot very much with the anti-Nazi cause. So it meant that when the Nazis invaded, they had to flee Paris. And when Vichy France struck its deal with the Nazis to surrender on demand, quote unquote, anybody the Gestapo wanted, they were in immediate peril. So whether it was fleeing to southern France, then fleeing to Italy once Vichy France became established, then fleeing a house that they had bought outside Florence to go back to France and try desperately to get an emergency visa from the US through Varian Fry, this humanitarian who was trying to get artists and intellectuals out of Europe, and then finally through Portugal to the US. That was my grandfather's experience, but literally at the same time, my dad has been drafted. He's part of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and is literally on the Russian front when his father is boarding an ocean liner to go to New York. So these vastly different things. And it really, one of the most emotionally moving parts of the whole process of telling this story for me was reading the letters back and forth where family members are trying to share with each other what they had gone through. And can't you understand what I went through? Oh, well, that was bad. Let me tell you what we went through. And my aunt, my dad's sister particularly, I think, nursed a lot of resentments, this feeling of having been abandoned. She describes in the book in vivid detail what it's like to go through bombing raids. She had an infant son, was living in Freiburg without her husband, who was on the front himself. And she writes these very affecting letters describing what it's like. And of course, she has no idea that her father had gone through his own hell trying to stay clear of the Gestapo and escaping. So it's almost as if after nine years of being unable to really face-to-face have these interactions, the war ends and this flood of sentiments come out in these letters. And that was rich material to play with.
Well, that was the highlights of the book for me. And it's interesting that in some of the letters, Kurt, who's sitting in the United States, has not been through this experience and doesn't have a lot of sympathy for Maria, his own daughter's point of view about this. And says, telling that to the Jews, try to make the Jews, the communist Estonians, or whoever it is, understand that, the Germans, whatever happened, the Germans brought it on themselves. And he's saying, and then earlier he's saying, telling his wife, Helen, I found this fat, do whatever, I hope we do what the Allies do, whatever they can to eradicate the Nazis, knowing full well his ex-wife, who he still has a good relationship with, his daughter and his son are still back there.
Yeah.
That was quite interesting.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And there was very, very public, famous criticism that Thomas Mann, the novelist, who was already in exile in the States, much like Kurt, said that, absolutely the Germans are covered in blood and shame, and no ifs, ands, and buts about it. And Kurt sides with Mann against his own daughter, who says there should be some sympathy for this brutal bombing campaign of civilians that took place. Indeed, it was. And it did very little to turn the tide of the war. We can agree now in hindsight. There was some hope in the Allied camp that German civilians would be so sick of the bombardment they would rise up and overthrow Hitler. But there was such fear, and the Nazi Gleichschaltung, this control of every aspect of German society, remained intact virtually up to the end of the war. And perhaps the most vivid example of that came down to me, not from my father. As you said, Bill, he was reluctant to talk about the war. I wouldn't say he wouldn't talk about the war, and he never dodged questions if I asked them. But he was very, very keen to look forward and not look back. But he did talk very, very openly to my brother-in-law about one incident he never told me about. And it was just days before capture at the Battle of the Bulge. And German units had been blown to bits, and they were kind of recomposing themselves in retreat. And there were about 7 or 8 of them, including my dad. And there was a commanding officer who held rank, probably an SS member, because that's what the Nazis were doing, because they were concerned about morale and defections and so forth. And this SS officer was the only person in this group who didn't want to surrender to the Allies. And it was an angry argument, and the officer turned his back, and another soldier in my dad's group shot him dead. And it was a story that my dad had suppressed, certainly hadn't shared with me. But after his death, I realized just how much he'd been carrying around all these years, even as he was determinedly assimilating and adopting the protective coloration of the gray flannel suit during the 50s and 60s, and marrying my mom, who was a Fairfield County WASP, and giving his 3 kids every chance to make their way in America and start anew. So there were these revelations I was trying to find the context for. I mean, another example, my dad wasn't a literary person like his father, or even his sister, who loved art and literature and wrote these amazing letters. But he was a very dutiful son, and he would write letters back to his mom in Munich mostly, because he couldn't write to his father in New York from the Russian front, every week or two, and they covered the waterfront, and but one of the things I was struck by was he would detail how well he was eating. He's in the Ukraine, and it was only after getting to Berlin and picking up Tim Snyder's great history, Bloodlands, about Stalin and Hitler and what happened to Poland and the Ukraine and the western reaches of the Soviet Union, that I realized that there had been an official Nazi policy to starve Slavs, Jews, and Soviet prisoners by having German soldiers live off the land and any excess go back to Germany to keep German civilians fat and sassy and supporting the war effort. So essentially I discover in reading my dad's letters alongside the history that my dad was basically made a party to genocide against anything he could control, simply by eating his rations. And that might have been the most disturbing part of the book, but those were the kinds of issues that I was trying to reconcile and going over there, which my cousin Nico, my dad's godson, who's a lifelong German, exactly my age, also a journalist, he'd long ago gone through this process of, the German word is Vergangenheitsaufarbeiten, working off the past. But for me, it was all new. I'd postponed it, just as my dad had kind of shoved it to the side to get ahead in America, the 50s and 60s. I'd postponed it by rushing off to Ann Arbor to cover a Michigan Duke basketball game for Sports Illustrated.
I would say, I agree that your father was not the wordsmith that your aunt or your grandfather was, but as he was saying, journalism, his story kind of wrote itself. He had such great material. Great. It was horrifying, but going back to your point about the hunger plan, that one letter, well, you maybe describe it better, right? When he talks about, sees a Ukrainian using a pickaxe to get a piece of a partly rotten, frozen horse to cut into chops because of this hunger plan. It was just, it was devastating for me to read something like that.
Yeah, it was devastating for me to read. It was my dad at age 19. My dad was 12 when Hitler came to power. So there's no way I can really judge him. I really tried to suspend judgment and just be curious as much as possible. And that was the spirit I tried to bring to the book. Now, there were other relatives, come to find out. Nobody in my family ever told me about my grandmother's brother, my dad's favorite uncle, who was a director of Merck, the pharmaceutical company in Darmstadt, who was a member of the SS. And he didn't wear a uniform and he didn't serve on the front. He was considered most valuable at the factory. But modern day Merck in Germany has been very transparent, ordered up a few years ago a full history with a special emphasis on Merck's implication in the Third Reich, and threw open their archives to me. And I discovered all sorts of things, including his denazification hearing statement that he gave to the tribunal. And to learn all that, and then to read my dad's letter back to Kurt, describing my dad's visit after the war to the ruined home in Darmstadt where Wilhelm used to live, but was now living in the backyard in a garden shed. And that was a pretty moving thing too. So there's literature in this book because Kurt published a lot of great writers, and both in Germany and in the US. But there's a lot of just powerful war stuff, and powerful not only on the soldierly side, but also on the civilian side.
Go on.
Well, and the one other thing I just, I thought I'd put on the record, I hadn't realized when I embarked on this, and even growing up and knowing vaguely that my grandfather was a man of real distinction in Germany and in the US, I hadn't known enough to know that he had built a very successful publishing house in Germany before the war that remained successful during the war, but then just collapsed through the 20s because of the Weimar hyperinflation, and then of course the rise of the Nazis, because nobody was interested in the kind of stuff he was publishing. It was disapproved of, and Germans just didn't have the money to buy these beautiful books of plates of artwork that he would publish. So then he goes into exile, not even fluent in English, and he founds a publishing house that publishes Gift from the Sea by Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Doctor Zhivago by Pasternak, huge sellers, massively successful, but irony alert, because the house is suddenly successful, that niche of publishing, fine literature is suddenly eclipsed because the board of Pantheon realizes there's a lot of money to be made in modern publishing and wants to take the house in a different direction. So he gets forced out at Pantheon in a boardroom coup and goes into exile back to Europe for the last years of his life. So you have this kind of double exile experience that he went through. And that was an overlay of poignancy that I hadn't expected as I dug into the story.
But you make this distinction, I think, very clearly and appropriately in the book. Your grandfather was exile, double exile, but your father was an immigrant and lived a full immigrant experience. Talk a little bit about that and how different that is, an exile versus an immigrant in America.
Yeah, and it's been so interesting. People's reaction to the book, I just assumed because Kurt Wolff had this profile and his famous authors, and he's a charismatic figure with a kind of checkered personal life. I mean, there's great stuff there. And in fact, a lot of the feedback I get is about my dad, who is just a nose to the grindstone, just want to make it immigrant. And there seems to be more mystery to him. I mean, he wasn't that mysterious to me. He's just a very practical man. He gets on the boat to come to the US. Kurt has finally become a US citizen by 1946. And my dad is learning English in Munich after he comes back, after being released from an American POW camp. He's learning English by listening to Luncheon and Munchin, the jazz show, noontime on American Forces Radio. And he'd done some studies in chemistry, and Kurt was able to work his exile network in Princeton and got the head of the chemistry department, who was a British chemist, atomic chemist, who was an immigrant himself, to say, if he can get a student visa, we'll have him here for graduate work. And so my dad has a chance to come over. He gets on the boat. He has $10 in his pocket. A priest from New Jersey of German descent, who's been visiting relatives, introduces him to bingo on the ship. He turns his $10 into $19 by winning a round, quits while he's ahead, is met at the pier by his father with $19 in his pocket, and he never looked back. And it's very hard for me to fault him for not wringing his hands or agonizing or wallowing in the past when he was given at age 27 this chance to kind of start life anew. So that was my dad. Always loved his Wurst and a beer. You couldn't take that German out of him, but so devoted to America, so devoted to democracy. He and I bonded over the Watergate hearings because he couldn't believe that there were people in the Justice Department who were going to refuse to follow orders and be fired happily because they had self-respect and they were going to stand up to the White House. And that was a moment where I got a little glimpse into my dad and what he'd been through. The other moment, of course, was when our next door neighbor in Princeton, New Jersey, when I was growing up, who worked for the Boy Scouts of America up Route 1, he would slip me copies of Boy's Life and the Scout Handbook. And I told my dad I wanted to become a Boy Scout. I wanted to take the oath and wear the uniform and have the insignia patch on my arm. And my dad looked at me and said, I was in the Hitler Youth. You're not going to become a Boy Scout. So every now and then, his experience would kind of rear its head. And I was reminded, oh, I'm not like all the other kids in the neighborhood.
Also, on that very point, there's a telling anecdote when you talk to your parents about becoming a journalist, and you mentioned sports, and you think, oh, it's just like a lot of parents. People think sports is the toy department of journalism. It's not serious journalism, and they want you to become they want you to go work at National Geographic, let's say. But then you go, there may be another reason. It's because the Nazis loved spectator sports, and they didn't like what it represented. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, my dad was very wary of sports. He broke his nose 3 or 4 times playing field hockey in boarding school. He never talked to me about the Max Schmeling, Joe Louis fight or the 36 Olympics in Berlin. When he was a 15-year-old boy, you'd think he would have drunk all that up, but he was very wary of it. His father had been very wary of it. My dad liked art and theater and music and technical things. And yeah, I think he was just wary of it because of the way it had been repurposed for nationalistic ends. Or that's what, giving it a good think while working on this project, that's what I came up with as the explanation. But yeah, he was a great believer of America. I mean, he would fly the flag on Memorial Day and the 4th of July. And he actually, he believed that senators could be great statesmen. He loved William Proxmire, the guy from Wisconsin who would do the Golden Fleece Award, would keep citizens from getting ripped off, the taxpayers from being ripped off. And so there was something very touching about his devotion to democracy. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to fold what America was going through while I was in Berlin into the book, because it was impossible not to imagine a little bit what my dad would have said if he were still alive. He had died in 2007. And in some moments I would say to myself, boy, I'm glad he's not alive to see this.
Well, the book is abundantly clear. You are relentless and leaving no stone unturned when it comes to finding out any associations your family may have had with the Third Reich. But I want to come back to your relationship with your father, and you described him quite well. But talk a little bit about you, because I think in the book you say very clearly, it never occurred to me to force a reckoning with my father. You ask yourself, and you're pretty hard on yourself, I think, why didn't I ask more questions when I had the chance? Maybe like a lot of Germans today, I was afraid of the truth, or maybe I was afraid he would lie. In other words, you take yourself to task for a little bit for not knowing more. Is that fair to say?
Well, if I was afraid he wouldn't tell the truth, it wasn't because I considered him to be a liar or not willing to tell me the truth, but because I've always known him to be a protective person, and he would want to protect me if there was something that would be difficult. Everything that I'd witnessed in his behavior toward me in my life to that point, he'd had that paternal instinct to protect. So I do rehearse that as a possible explanation for my reticence. But there was a moment in the mid-90s, we took a trip together, father-son trip down the Danube. The cruise began in Nuremberg, which is a detail that I invested with all sorts of meaning after the fact, and ended in Budapest. And it was about 10 days on the water, and he would point out places that he'd visited as a kid, sometimes on trips with his boarding school classmates. And it was my chance to ask him about the war and how he survived it all and what it was like. And we did go over some of that grounding. I asked him if he knew about the death camps. And he said he didn't. He did overnight in Auschwitz when he was going from one theater of World War II to another. and he saw trucks and he saw people in striped uniforms and assumed that they were forced laborers. He certainly knew that there were forced laborers, but he didn't know about death camps. And I know a lot of German civilians in real time did know about them, because the way Jews and their belongings were being liquidated, you couldn't do that if you were the Third Reich without engaging lots of civilians to get the job done. So I play this trick on myself where I assume because my dad is on the Russian front and he's consumed with his own duties there and unwittingly being conscripted into the hunger plan, that he might have been oblivious to this. But I honestly don't know. And I also don't know to what extent he, as a Wehrmacht soldier, might have been implicated in roundups, because the Wehrmacht was used sometimes for that. Now, he was attached to an air squadron, and it mostly meant delivering maps and reconnaissance photos around the Ukraine. And his letters home make that clear that that's indeed what he was doing. He not only took photographs, but he was very good with watercolors, and he would sometimes send his mother little paintings of what it was like. But yeah, the picture of my dad that I got from all the documentary evidence was very much the one that I knew of growing up. And I think the one thing that he turned to later in life that kind of squares the circle for me is he became very involved in the Upper Valley in a group called Bridges for Peace that did exchange programs with Soviet citizens. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't help but think, okay, this is a guy who actually sat through a bombing raid when he was back visiting his mother in Munich once, and turned to his sister and mother and said, this is like being a rat in a trap. I'd rather die at the front. So here he was actually helping a squadron find rats and traps. And later in his life, he was involved in this effort. And it seemed to me to be very much a kind of atonement exercise.
There's one more generation that was affected by this, your whole journey, and that's your children, who are Nico's grandchildren. And I just think of this very moving anecdote you tell early in the book about, in 2012, you're part of the team that Sports Illustrated sends to London to cover the summer games there. And as you take the family with you, and then you go and visit the cabinet war rooms where Churchill directed the British response to the Blitz. And you say, and your daughter's 9 at the time. And afterwards we go sit in the cafeteria or whatever, and she's figured out who the good guys and the bad guys were by this time. And she looks up to you and says, quote, "Is there some way Opa could have been a spy?" And that must have been hard to hear from a 9-year-old daughter.
Yeah, she knew just enough. I mean, we talked about the Blitz, and we'd seen St. Paul's Cathedral and knew that it had been bombed. And she knew and loved her Opa, you know, but she was able to form that question. And it was a question that from 2012 to the time we went to Berlin was kind of nagging at me. And this book was going to be a chance to answer that question at length and with nuance, and without judgment done kind of heedlessly. If there were going to be any judgments, they were going to be done with evidence and with good due consideration. But yeah, it was a question. You know, the thing about children and the questions they ask. I do point out in the book that one of the books that Kurt published was The Tin Drum by Gunter Grass, and that's the story of a 3-year-old who decides he's not going to grow beyond 3 and confronts his elders by pounding away at a drum. And it was clearly Grass's way of saying that the younger generation needed to hold to account Germans who'd been implicated in the Nazi catastrophe. And the epigraph to the book is from W.G. Sebald, the German novelist, whose books are all about this silence and the inability of Germans to talk about this stuff in the post-war. And it's this wonderful quote from Austerlitz, where the main character is a child in Prague, and he's asking his the matron who's looking after him, as she reads a children's story, how the squirrels know where they've buried their hoard when all the snow falls on the ground. And there are these very, very simple questions that children can frame. And adults, our heads are too cluttered and our lives are too busy to kind of get to that essence that makes for a beautiful, simple question. So to Clara, my daughter, I'm really grateful for that. And to she and her brother Frank, I've dedicated the book.
Not shift gears, but shift people here. I know Kurt and Nico are the dual backbones of this book, but there are some women who play some very important roles here, and they're very interesting. So we have some time. I mean, particularly your Nico's sister Maria. When you've talked a little bit about her already, how she was bombed out of her apartment, gave birth during an air raid, and but then there's Elizabeth, Nico's mother and Kurt's first wife, who is the Merck heiress, and she maintained a close relationship with Kurt even long after they were divorced. And there's finally, which I think may be the most fascinating one of all, is Helen, Kurt's second wife, who he marries at she's his secretary at his publishing house in Germany, if I remember correctly. And then she goes on with him and becomes the real, I guess, I think it's the real workhorse of this publishing firm in America, doing all the editing. And then when Kurt dies, she keeps the imprint with Harcourt Brace going for another 30 years on her own. It's quite an interesting collection of ladies here.
And I didn't really think about it, how the gender roles in the book broke down. I mean, when I was working on it, it just seemed that this spine of the book was going to be the patrilineal stories, grandfather, father, and me. But then there's this kind of Greek chorus of women's voices, and they're usually on the page. Now, Maria, I did talk to her over the years. She was a wonderful storyteller. She loved to gossip. And a lot of the detail is from her in actual conversations we had. But she also wrote, in addition to these magnificent letters, she wrote this very affecting anonymous essay about her and Nico's reunion with Kurt for the first time after the war. So this would have been in 46 or 47. They meet at the Swiss border for the first time. And she's still working through a lot of these mixed emotions of feelings of abandonment. She's convinced herself that Kurt is living this charmed life when she has really no idea of the difficulties he's having as an immigrant and actually an enemy alien for the first 4 years of their life in New York. And then Helen, of course, just a magnificent writer of letters. And in fact, the piece in the book that I actually let out a yelp when I found it, because it was about 3 weeks before I had to turn the manuscript in. But shortly after Kurt dies in 1963, Helen writes Elizabeth a letter. And imagine reading the letter that's sent from one woman who is married to a man to the other woman who had been married to that same man. And I'm not going to spoil it for anybody here on this chat, but it's just so honest and such a piece of confidence that I felt I almost had to look away. And it was written in Helen's hand, which was almost impossible for me to decipher. And I was able to find a few miles from where I live at Middlebury College, someone in the German department there had a hard time too, but she was ultimately able to riddle it out for me. And when I could see the meaning of it, I realized I had this wonderful little piece to the whole story.
In another place you talk about, I'm gonna go back to not so much direct complicity, but turning their heads the other way. You had this wonderful quote from Gunter Grass about the rise of Nazism, and it's because we let citizens stop being citizens, and you can't leave politics to the politicians. And then you ask this question about your family, and I think you mean everybody, not just Kurt and Nico. Was there devotion to high culture and education to blind them to the obligations of citizenship? A time comes when one needs to get out of the salon and help your neighbor down the street. And even Kurt makes that point, even though he has this very emotional exchange with his daughter about saying the German people are to blame for. He acknowledges it. He says, just because I left, what did he say? I think it was, just because you leave your country doesn't absolve you of responsibility.
Yes.
I was 43, I was in the First World War for Germany. I didn't leave Germany until I was 43 years old. So I bear some responsibility, even though I fled. But I thought that was interesting about whether your family, and I guess that I guess not so much Nico, bear some responsibility because they were too devoted to their life in the salon or high culture.
Yeah, I mean that's what Gross was pointing out with that comment, that and it's, I hesitate branding everybody with a broad brush, but there was this class of Germans, and many Jews were welcomed into that class. It was called the Bildungsbürgertum, so the sort of educated upper middle class who just loved art and music and books and collected them and regarded life as a chance to kind of learn more and become more enlightened. And if you do that, and if you're really devoted to that, it's easy to see how politics can seem grubby. And my great concern, and what seemed to jump out at me, was that Jews who stayed in Germany through 38, 39, 40, so many of them were kind of lulled into believing, well, there's no way this country that produced Beethoven and Goethe and all this wonderful culture that I love and that I've contributed to and supported, and Mendelssohn, who is Jewish himself, there's no way it can turn on me, or turn on me because I had served this country in World War I. And very early in the Nazi rule, Jews who had served in World War I were given a little bit more freedom and exempted from some of the worst of the Nazi codes, but those protections rapidly started to fall away. So it's just a question I raised. I'm not pointing the finger at anybody, I'm just wondering. And there was one particularly dear friend of my grandmother's, a Jewish woman whose Jewish husband was a director of a bank in Munich. And she had been the chaperone who would take Maria Nico down to southern France on school vacations when Kurt was in exile down there for visits. And on Kristallnacht, they both committed suicide. And what can you do but wonder, what could we have done? So I kind of walked through those questions here decades later.
Did you come? Are there any unanswered questions for you? Did you come away with any disappointments after this journey, after the trip to Berlin? Anything you really would have liked to have found that you didn't find?
Well, there are things I don't know because I probably will never know, and I suppose the biggest is exactly what my dad saw in the Ukraine. There's no question that if he had been captured in the East rather than in the West, he would have ended up, if he had survived, he would have ended up in a Soviet gulag and probably wouldn't have come back to Germany, if at all, until 3, 4, 5 years later, which his first cousin, that was his first cousin's fate, to come back much later and in terrible shape. Because so much happened in the East. That's really where the worst stuff went down. So I don't really know what he witnessed. And the letters home, I think, stop at a certain place because my dad knew his mother was a refined woman who, didn't want the china to get dirty or the linens to get dirty. So she wasn't really ready to deal with the realities of what was going on. So I'm sure he self-censored some. And of course, all his letters were being censored straight up through military censorship. But, just like that story my brother-in-law shared with me about that fragging incident just before my dad was captured by the Americans outside Wiesbaden. That was one story he never told me, and there surely are others. But I wasn't wringing my hands. I mean, I felt I had enough context, enough raw material, mostly the raw material, to tell a story. We all know that stories are highly selective, and I bring all my biases to the telling of this story, and the biases that were baked into the letters that my ancestors wrote. That's what I have to work with. But
give us a sense of how many letters are we talking about? Are we talking about thousands?
Well, I'd say I'm looking at the box right now. The letters my dad sent home during the war, so this would be from 41 through early 45, allowing for a 5-month leave when he came home to Munich. It was a leave that saved his life because he saw a poster in the barracks that said they had openings to study chemistry in Munich. That got him off the Eastern Front, so when he was redeployed after his study leave, he was sent to the Western Front, which meant he was captured by the Americans. But they're probably about 75 or 80 letters, and they're all tucked back into the envelope in which they were sent with a postmark, so I know exactly where he was. And he translated them all before he died and annotated them. So I think he knew. I remember we took our Danube cruise. At one point, we were deep in discussing things, and he turned to me and he said, "Maybe someday you'll write about this."
But besides, there were dozens of other letters between among other family members. And
not all of them have survived, but because a lot of them were Kurt's, and their archives both at Yale on this side of the Atlantic and the German Literary Archive near Stuttgart on the other side of the Atlantic, they have these things because my grandfather is a person of some scholarly interest. And he would talk about his personal circumstances in some of these letters, which is gold, to have that stuff. But the richest stuff, again, are from the women in my family. And those letters and Maria's reminiscence about the reunion at the border, that's the miracle of my ancestors having OCD. They're pack rats, and they kept them, and they somehow survived. I have a cousin over in Munich who actually has pretty much a duplicate set, and he's digitized them all. So I am lucky in a way that I certainly pity the biographers of tomorrow who are going to wish that people hadn't emptied their caches of email.
We're running out of time. I want to ask you one, shift a little bit. This is more of a writerly question. Although the book is a historical chronicle and wrestles with a number of difficult questions, it remains an entertaining, multi-generational saga. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges involved in treating such serious issues without sacrificing the pace of the narrative? It just to me, it was a structural masterpiece in that sense.
Well, the biggest thing I tried to keep in mind was that chronology is my friend. There was an early draft where I was not hewing to that, and Peter Blackstock and Morgan Entrekin at Grove Atlantic were kind enough to say, look, we can either cut your manuscript into little strips and lay them on a conference room floor and rearrange them ourselves, or you can do the job. So they kicked it back to me and I did it. And if you let the chronology of the kind of spine of the narrative play out, then the reader is on some kind of terra firma, and that allowed me to jump into the present with these little journalistic interludes tacked on to many of the chapters. So if I wanted to talk, for instance, about the German elections, or describe a visit to the villa on the Wannsee in Berlin where the final solution was plotted, or talk about visiting the Ravensbrück concentration camp north of Berlin, I could include these and allude to things going on in the main narrative, but the reader very quickly turns the page, new chapter, there's date stamped, we know who the main characters are, and we're back telling their story. So I did find that to be the most convenient way to kind of lay down that track. And if we're going to do a little side trip, it was going to be a cloverleaf that took you very quickly back to the main track. And I'm glad to hear that you felt it worked. I mean, I was ambitious with this thing. I was trying to do a little biography, as you pointed out, as well as history and journalism. But I figured if the history was there and was laid down explicitly, then I could take those liberties.
Yeah, I sort of just awed at the organization of it. It didn't seem like it just organized itself. It took a lot of thought on your part. I mean, you're making it sound easy, but it's not easy. It looks easy, and that's the hard part.
Well, and credit, you're an editor, Bill, so you'll appreciate it. I had great editors, and there were many drafts.
Did you have to do any cutting? I mean,
yes, I did. I did. And I had to do the same kind of cutting that I would do with SI stories, which was I had to suppress my instinct to say, hey, look what I found.
Yeah.
And realize that, okay, a letter that Kurt wrote in World War I that's kind of stream of consciousness about a day in the life of the war, a little goes a long way. I didn't have to go on for 3 pages. I could do a couple of paragraphs and the reader would get the gist of it. And I think the book is about 100,000 words, which from what I understand is the beau ideal of literary nonfiction, that if you can keep it right at that length, that's sort of that's a portion that we can swallow as a reader. I'm not talking about the doorstop biographies of great historical figures, but something where you're asking of people their time.
Right. Well, I think it works marvelously. It's a great read, and you learn a lot. And thank you very much for giving us this.
Thank you, Bill. No, it's great to talk about it with you. And yes.
So
And thank you, Norman Williams, for having me. Thank you, Meg.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm seeing just a couple questions from the audience, so maybe we can scoop 1 or 2 of them up. One of them is, I think, probably maybe an easy question. Are there any relatives of your dad's generation left?
There are not. There are not. I have the oldest cousin I have is in his early to mid 70s now. Mid 70s, I guess would be. He's about 75, and he happens to be this incredible history buff, and is the guy who digitized the archive. So I'm so grateful for him. But actually, now that I think of it, my dad's half brother is still alive, Christian Wolff. He lives actually in Royalton. He's a retired Dartmouth professor, and he has all his marbles, and true to the Wolf pack rat mentality, has all sorts of boxes in his attic. So I'm very, very grateful to him too. So those are probably the 2 linchpins within the family in being able to tell this story.
He was part of that harrowing escape from Vichy France.
He was actually
a child.
Yeah, his belongings were smuggled in the handcart of a farmer. He and his belongings smuggled in the handcart over the border of a farmer going to market, and that's how he got back out of Nazi-occupied France to the southern zone where he could be reunited with Kurt and Helen and make his way to America.
Well, I'm going to give the last question to Steve Chapman, and I have so many questions, but I'm going to have to finish reading the book and then maybe send you an email. So Steve writes, your old basketball writings always seem more than just Duke versus Michigan. It's been a long time since I read Big Game, Small World, but it seemed to me a thoughtful and open-hearted inquiry into the human spirit across cultures through the lens of street basketball. Is there any connection at all between this search and your powerful reflection on your family's history through Nazi Germany?
I suppose there must be, Steve. Thanks for the question. A lot of my SI work, you'd be surprised how much it prepared me to do this, because certainly the last 10, 12, 15 years I was at SI, I found myself doing a lot of historical pieces. So I learned my way around an archive, and stories are stories, and you tell. You flesh out characters, and there's beginnings and endings and moments of drama, inflection points, and yes, I have been lucky enough to get the assignments that involved something more than just the X's and O's, which was what really attracted me to writing Big Game, Small World, which was sort of using sport as a lens through which to look at a culture. But this had the whole personal dimension that made it a more intense experience, and of course, it was a book. Which took 4 years, decades, if you consider all the gathering of information, just kind of throwing things into a folder or talking to my Aunt Maria. But really, from start to finish of actually doing the book, it was a good 4-year experience.
I do want to mention that we are recording tonight's event, so I will be posting that at some point on the Norman Williams Library page, as well as on our Facebook page. But there is a great question here, and not an easy one. It says, when looking for insights and lessons from history, is it possible to engage Americans today in the phenomenon of German nationalism, the rise of Nazism, and the Holocaust? That's a kind of a tough question.
Yeah, I do think it's possible to engage Americans today in all this stuff. I mean, just 2 days ago, the New York Times ran a very interesting op-ed about an issue I grapple with in the book, which was May 8th, 1945, a day of defeat for Germany or a day of liberation for Germany? And I feel very strongly that it was a day of liberation. I mean, when I look at my father's life, my existence is the result of Germany having been liberated that day, and all those Allied soldiers sacrificing their lives on D-Day and afterward, and the whole effort to liberate Germany. And I understand some of the issues that were brought up in that op-ed, that you don't want to lightly, just in a blanket fashion, consider it a day of liberation, because then it might seem to absolve Germans and of their history, for which they needed to be defeated. But I think it is really important to engage these things, and I think Americans, particularly given Charlottesville in June and January 6th, those twin events, which kind of sit as bookends in some way for me around my experience with this book, it means that things can happen anywhere, and the vigilance that is required to make sure that it doesn't is something that we should all be reminding ourselves of. And whether it's done, we don't have stumbling stones, the Stolpersteine, like they have in Berlin and many German cities, but I wish that we had more public places of reflection where we can think hard about the issues that have bedeviled us as Americans, like slavery and Jim Crow and racial violence.
I will say that Alex does make that point in the book very well. The way we've dealt with our original sin, slavery and racial injustice, it's very different from the way the Germans have dealt with it. And he has one fact that's very quick or two facts that I think is revealing. We had the Holocaust Museum and Memorial was built in 1993 in Washington, D.C. We didn't have our first memorial to anything about slavery or Jim Crow and any of that until 18 years later. Is that right? Yeah, 2011. And that was the statue of Martin Luther King. So it took us 18 years. We had to get to acknowledge slavery in any real way in Washington after we had the memorial, the Holocaust Memorial.
Yeah, no, it did strike me. And there's a wonderful book I read while working on mine called Learning from the Germans by an American political philosopher who's from Atlanta, and she's Jewish, and she lives and works now in Berlin. So she's a perfect person to write the book. But Germans were appalled that she titled her book that way. But it does wonderful work making some of these connections between how a civil society can jointly memorialize and remember. So here I am recommending another book, not my own. But
well, speaking of which, your book is available locally in Woodstock through our independent bookstore, Yankee Bookshop, and they sell online. You can go in person. They also do curbside. They can ship anywhere, or your favorite independent bookstore wherever you are. And of course, any bookstore or big box place is going to have Alex's book. But of course, we encourage you to shop at our independent booksellers. Thank you both so much for this evening. And Alex, I hope you will come visit us in Woodstock and, read more from your book, and maybe a sampling from all of your books at some point. It's great to have you, and nice to get to know you a little bit, and so much about your personal history that is a history relevant to all of us.
Thanks so much, Meg. It was my pleasure. Thank you again.
Thank you, Meg, and thanks to the library, everybody at the library. It's events like this with people like Alex that make the Normal Winds Public Library what it is. Thank you.
Thank you both. And thank you to our audience.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.